And we're live this time with Aarvoll, who identifies as Christian and was briefly involved in propertarianism and identifies as a nationalist. Is that right?
No, I do not identify as a nationalist.
You don't? Oh, okay.
I'm sympathetic to the issues that nationalists are concerned with, preserving cultures, demographic integrity, things like that. But I don't think nationalism optically is the way to go. And also, I think there are long-term problems with nation states as a kind of organizing principle of human political life. I'm more of, I don't want to say I'm a futurist in the sense of like a Kurzweil, but I am looking to technological change and seeing inconsistencies with the nation state as a really effective mode of government in the future.
Could you stop there? What is futurism? And then you used a word that I didn't quite understand.
Kurzweil is just a famous technologist. He makes predictions about the singularity, AI and this sort of thing. And his concepts are certainly exaggerated. He sensationalizes. But so I am a futurist in the sense that I think our political thought has to respond to coming technological changes. A working class revolution becomes less feasible, for example, with increased automation, reliance on robotics and AI. So these sorts of changes technologically have to be factored in. So I wouldn't call myself a nationalist. I'm looking to alternative networks based on, decentralized communication technologies.
What does that mean?
Currencies, cryptocurrencies. I think the best way to go forward is just to build parallel infrastructure and organize.
I'm sorry. Could you stop? There's so many words I don't understand.
Okay.
So what do you mean by decentralized communications?
Well, for example, like television is centralized communication where there's one message that's distributed to a wide number of people. Social media is more decentralized in that the source of the messages is widespread, but then the servers are centrally hosted, and so they can be censored centrally. Blockchain, holochain can be used not only for currencies, but as a kind of communications infrastructure that is decentralized in its distribution. So there's no one central server, and there's no way to modify what kinds of messages people are sending. That's what Odyssey is based on. That's why people aren't afraid of being censored on Odyssey. The library blockchain makes it impossible to take things down because there's no one central point of access.
Okay, I don't understand the details of that, but yes, that sounds good. That nobody can take down what we put online, and then you were talking about. I hope you can just repeat the sentence that you just repeated. I know you didn't quite finish it because I stopped you, but there were so many concepts that were new to me that I hope you'll explain them.
Yeah, sure. So I think you saw my channel because of the stream that I had with Joel Davis about nationalism. And the basic disagreement I had with him was that the nation state is not going to be the relevant unit of political change going forward. Nationalist revolutions are unlikely to take place. And the reason for that is that the way that culture is being distributed, the way that economic activity is distributed is from the top down within a group that is using the internet, global information technologies, and a nationalist uprising against a global economic system just can't work. And then the other reasons I was disagreeing with nationalism just have to do with long-term security. I think the Earth needs a way of organizing itself at a global scale We have to have some kind of political class looking over the earth as a whole. We do have that. The globalists are establishing international law in their image. They see the need to respond to, threats of climate change or, potentially meteors. There's all sorts of threats that could impact the earth as a whole, and individual nation states can't respond to many of these threats. We don't think in the timescales where these things are relevant, but natural disasters happen that would require global cooperation since we have a global economic system. So like a lot of the points that the globalists make, I agree with in principle, but the way that the current globalists are implementing them will result basically in like global slavery, in my opinion. And so instead of that, I would aim for a global kind of high IQ alternative elite that can rise up due to the kinds of information technologies we now have access to. So building parallel infrastructure and tackling global problems, not from the ground up, not from the bottom up, in that this would be like a mass proletarian revolution. But I see that they're like in alt tech, people involved in cryptocurrencies, not that that's the one technology that's the end all be all of all of this, but the people who are tuned into the technological space as it exists now have an opportunity to set up alternative networks to the mainstream grid economically, in terms of communities. And I think that's a much more productive direction to go. Nationalist revolutions won't happen. The information control by the global elite is too absolute. And so you have to create alternative information networks and bring people gradually into them and offer the services that government has traditionally offered, like, a kind of insurer of last resort, like providing security, like providing education, these sorts of things. Offer those instead of the government in a way that is better than the government. And that in real world terms just looks like a network of alternative communities, right? So that's what I've always advocated. And that can be done now, it can be built now without trying to create political change explicitly. But long run, if you set up these parallel networks, they can kind of fill the role that government has traditionally filled. And then if there is at some point a natural disaster or other crisis scenario, you have a parallel, resilient alternative that has been intelligently designed. And if the globalist system fails, then there you are to kind of pick up the pieces. So I think nationalism is too confrontational. It doesn't address problems of global cooperation that do long run need to be addressed. And it's just, there's very limited things you can do with it. I mean, at best.
What are the long-term problems that need to be addressed? I didn't quite get that.
Say again?
You said something about long-term problems that need to be addressed. What did you mean by that?
Right, like, okay, in a world filled with sovereign nation states that make their own decisions, and there's no formal system of global cooperation, if an asteroid was headed towards the Earth, how do you cooperate and address that threat? What if Russia has one idea, China has another, the US has another, and each of these three nations pursue their independent responses to the global threat? Well, it may be that Russia wants to send up a nuke to blow it up. China wants to attach some kind of solar sail to misdirect it. The US has some other technology. They all try to implement this, and the result is none of these strategies work because it's not a coordinated attempt. Climate change, the same kind of thing. Many people dismiss the possibility of climate change. I don't care whether anthropogenic global warming is happening, but global climate change will happen, always has happened. It fluctuates in long-term cycles. And, you have to be able to move global production chain.
So you are in favor of global government. You just don't like the form it is taking now. Is that what you're saying?
There are certain problems that are of a global scale that have to be addressed globally.
Right.
longer.
And
And technological development, I think, is the most important one of these, right? This is the point
right.
that I made with Joel that I don't think many people understood. It's not a commonly understood talking point, but the elites are aware of this argument, right? The global elites. It's that every new technology has intended consequences and then unintended consequences. And as the sophistication of technology increases, sometimes unintended consequences can be devastating, right? You
Such
don't
as?
realize, well, such as like genetic engineering and the possibility of releasing some sort of virus. For example, COVID
Or the
itself,
pill,
right?
even.
That
Or the pill.
supposedly COVID came out of a program, a research program to tinker with the genetic code of coronaviruses to study what it would do.
Or the pill.
What's that?
Or the pill.
The
The
contraceptive
contraceptive
pill?
pill. Would you include that in your list of unintended consequences?
I'm sorry, not really coming through clear here. Are you saying the birth control pill?
Yes.
Yeah, that there are massive unintended consequences of birth control. Hormonal imbalances in women lead to psychological disorders, long-term fertility. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Right. And may I know what attracted you into politics? Was there some issue that you were concerned about that made you enter politics?
Yeah, I don't really think in terms of politics. I'm against political ideology, political thinking, because I think it's too shallow. What I've always been about is building and finding an integrated philosophical foundation, like a philosophy of life in general, economics, social cooperation. I don't like thinking in terms of partisan politics or different political ideologies. I'm looking for the true philosophy and building communities that are based on that true philosophy and then spreading those communities,
It sounds
irrespective
like
of what other
you're
political
trying
actors want to
to.
do.
Sounds like you're looking for a religion or in a process of creating one.
Well, religion has done this historically. It has been that guiding worldview underlying civilizations. And the one that the West has operated on has failed for a variety of reasons. I think
Oh,
that's
so
because
you're agreeing with me that Christianity has failed?
mainstream Christianity has absolutely failed. Yes.
Ah,
It isn't
and
doing what it's supposed to do, like at a civilizational scale. It's not, the values of Christianity are no longer salient. Secular humanist values are more relevant in all Western countries. The US was lagging behind other countries in those terms, but even here, like I go to church and it's all old people. The young people don't go to church. It's not relevant. So yeah, it's failed, no question. Now, I think part of the reason for that is the history of early Christianity, where orthodoxy was built, what orthodoxy decided on, and then the kind of institutional structures, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and eventually even the structures of Protestant churches, the way that they allowed for ideological, philosophical progression was not adaptive. And so they ended up being backwards. They couldn't keep up with current scientific theories. They appeared outmoded. And this, I mean, that's why there were so many debates between atheists and Christians in like 2008, 9, 10, 11. Everybody was watching that stuff. And it became clear that very few Christians could respond to objections from the kind of secular worldview that they were up against.
what denomination are you?
Well, I practice Catholic, but I don't really subscribe to the whole set of beliefs that any one Christian denomination holds. I would call myself a Christian perennialist.
What does that mean?
Perennialism, also called like Sophia perennis, is a term I believe coined by Leibniz, the 17th century philosopher, to refer to a set of doctrines, metaphysically, ethically, that can be found in a wide variety of world religions that aren't specific to any one. And so
You mean
basically,
the
it's a
Noahide
different, it's an
laws?
alternative metaphysics to Orthodox Christianity.
Could you give an example of what you mean by that?
Well, Hinduism, there's Sufism within Islam, the kind of mystic traditions of the various world religions. Obviously, Buddhism, Taoism fall in line with this Sophia Perennis idea. Occult traditions within the West, Hermeticism, even Kabbalah, those could be included in this Sophia Perennis concept. It's a set of metaphysical doctrines that are
Right.
widespread around the world,
Have
including
you heard of
things
the
like,
Noahide?
what's that?
I was going to ask you if you've heard of the Noahide laws, because these are supposed to be universal and eternal. Have you heard of them?
The Noahide laws. Yeah, that's all according to the Old Testament. Like all humanity is subject to these most basic kind of laws established while, after the flood, I suppose. So everyone who's descended from Noah should be following the Noahide laws according to Abrahamism, basically, right?
Yes. So, yes.
Right. But I don't accept the historical claims of the Old Testament. I think there are myths grounded in realities, but I don't think a global flood happened. I think we're getting
Well, we don't have to, go into the truth of the narrative. We're just talking about the laws. Do you,
okay.
you don't think they're fair enough, or do you, the Noahide laws?
Well, why don't you recount them for me? I don't think I remember finding anything objectionable in them, but what are they exactly?
Okay, so it's the prohibition against murder, the prohibition against theft, the prohibition against sexual immorality, the prohibition against eating an animal while it's still alive, the positive commandment to establish a court and legal system, and the last two would be the prohibition against idolatry and blasphemy. Those are the 7 Noahide laws.
The only one that I would find objectionable is the prohibition against idolatry and blasphemy.
Why is that?
Because blasphemy is defined in terms of some religious worldview, ideology, philosophy, and what exactly is that philosophy that blasphemy is defined against, right?
Well, it would be defined against Jesus, I suppose, because Christians know that he was crucified for blasphemy after being convicted of it.
Right. Blasphemy against the Pharisees, Pharisaic Judaism, Orthodox Judaism at the time. And I don't believe that Orthodox Judaism had the correct metaphysics, theology, system of ethics. I don't believe that was the one universal kind of truth that mankind needs to abide by. I disagree with, Orthodox Judaism.
Right. So, but the prohibition against idolatry is absolute for Jews. That that there must be no confusion between God and His creation, and therefore idolatry is the worship of anything that isn't God, and
right. Yeah, and I disagree with that. I have no problem with having an attitude of worship towards things in the world, not confusing particular things with God, but seeing God in particular things. I have no problem with. Like, one of the most basic ideas in perennialism is the idea that all is Brahman, right? Brahman being this kind of metaphysical ultimate in Hinduism, and everything, the world is a representation of the nature of Brahman. It's Brahman's self-knowledge, right? So
so there's Atman and Brahman. So
yeah,
perhaps you can explain to me the difference between the two.
well, Atman is Brahman. Ultimately, that's one of the conclusions in the Upanishads. But the Atman is more the individual soul. So if you think about, like, stripping away all of your accidental mental properties, you could change your beliefs, you could change your perceptions, you could change all sorts of things about you. But at the core, you're going to have the brute fact of your awareness as such, the kind of most essential nature of your being, and the perceiver of that that which perceives can't be conditioned in the way that your particular historical identity is conditioned, right? Because before you acquired your beliefs, before you had any of your particular qualities, you had this brute fact of awareness. There's something ultimately generic. The nature of perception itself is in a way universal. So the perceiver of all perceptions is in some sense one and the same. So all
right.
Yeah.
Could I stop you there just so I can quickly clarify? So Brahman is material. It's
No.
things, yes or not?
No, not material. Brahman, the concept is something like the totality of being and also the kernel of being. If you want to think about it in material terms, think about the kind of identity of the set of all things in the universe taken together. Call that totality, Brahman. And then also, if you look down into the very core of any being, that which it's built on, the indivisible unit, is going to be Brahman. Brahman is in all and also is the culmination of all. That's the concept, the metaphysical ultimate. Nothing is conceivable beyond that kind of pure unity that subsumes all multiplicity.
Right. So according to Wikipedia, which I'm looking at now, it says Brahman is connotes a highest universal principle, the ultimate reality in the universe, and Atman means
the soul, effectively.
The self.
Right.
Right. So, well, I guess it's quite confusing, and maybe it's just easier to think of the universe as a creation of the Abrahamic God, and
it may be easier for someone with that background. I wouldn't say that it's logically entailed by anything, and no first principles necessarily lead to it. The reason I reject that kind of Abrahamic creator God is that it's a set of arbitrary axioms laid down in scripture, and I don't know why I should accept them. The particular attitudes attributed to Yahweh.
Because it makes sense and is easy to understand rather than this Brahman Atman thing.
Yeah, but it's easy to understand for people from an Abrahamic tradition. But if you didn't have that Abrahamic conditioning and you were just thinking for yourself about the nature of reality, it may well be that this Brahman idea is a more organic, simpler kind of conclusion to come to.
Well, I mean, look at India. It's a twice fallen civilization.
It's also the longest lasting civilization. They've kept up their traditions from the Bronze Age, right?
Well,
we can't say that about
European
civilization.
Well, Hinduism wasn't really a thing until the British colonized India, and they thought, well, we have to, give a name for the religion of the peoples of the Indus Valley, and they thought, hey, Hinduism, but it's really a mishmash of these different beliefs that don't even agree with each other.
Well, there are different philosophical schools within Hinduism, but they're all united by the Vedas, and we can historically trace that back to, 1000 BC or so, a little bit older.
But they don't make sense for people now. They don't. Look at their civilization.
I don't know. I think India is more secure as a civilization, as a culture.
It was taken over by the Mughals and then by the British.
Birth rates, they're looking after their citizens better. I mean, in India,
do they? Does Modi look after Indian citizens better? Does Modi look after Indian citizens better?
I was speaking. What was that?
What does Modi listen? I'm afraid I have to stop you because you will just talk over me or it not allow questions to be asked.
Go ahead.
So are you saying that the Indian government treats Indians better than Western governments, than Christians or Muslims? Is that what you are in fact saying?
I think that the Indian nation is being better provided for in cultural and biological terms than any particular Western nation. Right? I do think
In
like, the
what
American
way?
people is an actual existing nation, and we are not being served by our government. It looks like we're being thrown under the rug by our
Well,
government.
because there is no rule of law in the West anymore, because Christianity has failed, and this is where we agree.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
I
So
see that,
India is surviving. India's birth rates are
well, it's in
high.
existence as the world's biggest democracy, but how that attests to its ability to prosper in the future is, well, I suppose if you have lots of people, then you're likely to survive any terrible government policies that end you up in being killed in wars and revolutions. So I suppose that might help you remain in existence just because you are so many. But there are other things that are important in order to keep your nation in existence, and that would be the rule of law. Would you agree with that?
That they need the rule of law. Yeah, that is one aspect that India is not as developed with. I mean, Western nations have a very robust history of common law, and being grounded in Abrahamic religion, which is very focused on law, is also a help in developing those legal traditions. So, in terms of legal traditions, yeah, India is far behind the West, but in terms of programs to help the success of their nation as a biological entity, India has done better. Like, for example, Indian expats often do very well in all these Western countries, and they send money back to India. If you want to get a technical education in India, the government will subsidize you, right? It would be
Yes, so
easier to get
that's
into.
probably because they
Huh?
are they are numerous, and they respect the institution of marriage and the family. It's very difficult to get a divorce in, well, it's not advantageous for the woman to get a divorce in India. So there is, well, relatively little divorce, but with the existence of no fault divorce in so many countries, not all just Western, you have unstable marriages, unstable families, and ultimately unstable societies not following the rule of law.
Right.
But I think it is actually marriage that manages to keep your society together, even if most of your beliefs are in fact nonsense, because it allows you to consolidate what you had,
Right.
and build upon that. Well,
Communities are built on families. You have to look after the family first. I agree.
yeah, because it's the building block of any society, whatever your race or nation, and this is something that the West has forgotten about because it's a matriarchy, which I define as a society prioritizing the preferences of unmarried parents who casually conceived and parented their illegitimate offspring.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far, but certainly, I mean, the influence of feminism has led to a more matriarchal structure than many societies. I think the chief problem in the West, though, is just parasitism and having a certain class of people in Western nations that are looking out for their own interests at the expense of the common people. And so they foster these kinds of antenatal, anti-patriarchal values.
You mean the elites who allow these principles,
Right, who
who
create and
encourage sexual
inculcate
liberation,
them.
hmm? Who inculcate them? Well, um, if the West were following its religion, which is Christianity, then it would know to penalize, to punish fornication and sodomy and that sort of thing, wouldn't it? But it seems that because Christianity has failed, all these things are allowed under liberalism, because liberalism in the 21st century means nothing more than sexual liberation from the rules of marriage and good parenting.
Well, sure, yeah, but why have we gone this way? It's because of this kind of parasitic elite. They're looking after their own interests, and they don't care if they're eroding the kind of cultural foundations of the people. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say it's because Christianity failed, and my thesis is that it's been failing for centuries. It didn't just fail in the half century we have had of feminism. It has been failing for a long time because Nietzsche said as long ago as the 1870s that God is dead and we have killed him.
Right. Well, the rise of rationalism, in I don't want to pin it all on France, but a lot of the French philosophers are responsible for this kind of secularizing, the rise of science in the 19th century. The European intellectual elites moved towards secular humanism.
Yes.
Yeah, and so
Did
it's
you
been a
listen?
long time coming, and
What you're
Christianity
saying?
couldn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm sort of getting a little excited just because what you're saying has echoes of that discussion that Daniel Hakikatju and Mark Collett were having. I wonder if you listened to that or were aware of it.
No. Mm-mm.
Do you know who he is, Daniel Hakikatju, of Muslim Skeptic?
No.
Oh, well, basically, he's this Persian who he's also a Texan, and he promotes Islam, and he had this debate with Mark Collett, who's a British ethno-nationalist, and he was basically saying that Enlightenment values and liberalism has destroyed Western civilization, and that Mark Collett should come to Islam because Islam would serve the interests of white nationalists better, or words to that effect. So that was why I got a little.
Yeah,
and you were saying the same thing as him.
Aside from Islam, yeah, I would say, but it's more complicated than just secularism. I think the esoteric currents underlying the rationalistic philosophers of the 1800s was a kind of perennialism. Ultimately, Masonry, Rosicrucianism, these ideas came out of a metaphysical concept that was more robust, and it led to building a more adaptive system of philosophy than the Christians could offer. So I think Christianity failed. Yep.
Were you just describing liberalism in your last few sentences?
Well, yeah, we think of liberalism as secular humanism, but it's really not rooted in atheism. It is rooted in a kind of spiritualist monism, these esoteric traditions like Masonry, like Kabbalah, that they found it useful to promote secular humanism so that they would not be persecuted for their beliefs in a predominantly Christian society, right? And so they led to the creation of philosophies that were more competitive among the intellectual class than Christianity. And that is why. It's because it made more sense. The kind of worldview, the scientific worldview that they came out with made more sense as a whole than Christianity. And I think the reason for that is that Christianity was never laid on its proper foundations. I think Christianity does have real roots in Platonism. It has roots in the philosophy that, Jesus represented. And the way I interpret it, I think there's a more kind of sound perennialist metaphysics that can be attached to Christianity and make sense of it. And you don't have to accept so much on faith. The problem with Christianity is that a lot of the doctrines you just have to accept on fiat from scriptural revelation. And because higher criticism has led to a lot of doubt of the authenticity of scriptures. Most people don't believe, even Christians don't believe that the entire Pentateuch was composed by Moses. These sorts of criticisms gave rise to doubts about the legitimacy of scriptural revelation. And so I don't think you should hang your religion on scriptural revelation. there's no reason to accept it at a purely philosophical level.
So are you saying that you accept the Trinity?
I have concepts similar to the Trinity, but I wouldn't say I'm a classical Trinitarian Christian. No.
Are you an Arian?
No.
So your beliefs are personal to you. There's no school of Christianity that reflects your belief in Christianity?
The way I interpret Jesus is very similar to the way that the Hindus interpret the concept of the avatar, right? So I look at the Christian symbols and I say these map on very well to this perennialist system of metaphysics that you can see in Hinduism, you can see in different occult traditions in the West, like Platonism, Hermeticism, these sorts of things.
Right.
And
I'll have to stop you there because all these words are meaningless for me. But
Okay.
Could I just paraphrase what I think you just said?
Okay.
Your beliefs are basically a mishmash of Christianity and Hinduism.
Yeah, that's fair. Sure. I'll go with that.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear about that. And this is because you reject the Trinity, but the Trinity is the indispensable ingredient of Christianity, is it not? Because once upon a time, all Christians were Trinitarians, because that was how it started off when it became the state religion of Rome under Constantine. Well,
it was allowed under Constantine. Yeah. So I don't think that all Christians were Trinitarians from the earliest days of Christianity. There were obviously
what was the Council of Nicaea about then? Because it was Constantine,
but that wasn't the beginning
of Christianity.
You're talking about 300 years after the fact.
Yes, I know, but then before Constantine had died, Christianity was not the religion of Rome, and after that, it became the religion that supported the divine right of kings to rule. That was the whole purpose of Christianity, and it was the Americans who rejected Christianity and monarchy with their American Revolution. Was it not?
I don't know. I think the Protestant Reformation did more to undo the divine right of kings than the American Revolution. But
well, they didn't really know what they were doing at the time, did they? I mean, the whole point of the Pope sending his bishops and archbishops and to be with a king it would be a barbarian king at the beginning, well, wouldn't it? There was a time when most monarchs in Europe were, they were barely literate, but they were impressed by the power of Rome because Rome used to be their conquerors and colonizers. So Rome, being the eternal city, and where the Pope came from, would have this kind of intellectual cachet. But eventually, when the European monarchs had a few generations of descendants who acquired an education and were able to read and write and speak Latin and that sort of thing, they had a few ideas of their own, and it was only natural that they would resent being told by the Pope whom they could or couldn't marry, as Henry VIII did. And that was the beginning of the Reformation, when they realized that the vicar of Rome was just an ordinary man, fallible as they were too, and they weren't going to be dictated by his political interests. So and eventually, the whole movement towards Protestantism was basically European monarchs saying, we'll be our own Pope, thank you very much. And that was basically what the Anglican Church was all about when Henry VIII became his own Pope.
Yeah, sure. I broadly agree with that. Yeah, and it wasn't just the cachet of Rome that led these European monarchs to accept clerical rule and interdiction. It's that the clerics, like you say, they were the only ones who were literate. They knew the kind of technologies of organization due to the centuries of the history of organization of the church and, the empire.
And the Roman Empire before it became Christian.
Yeah, I was just saying that. Right. And so they depended on the clerical caste to do their administrative business. And then eventually, as learning, the university system was established, what I broadly agree with the narrative you just painted, but that I wouldn't blame the decline of Christianity or the right of kings on the American Revolution. And also, I'm not a supporter
I think you
of
blame
the
it on the
divine right
Russian
of kings in
Revolution,
general.
and before that, the French Revolution, because all these, the American, French, and Russian revolutions represent rejections of absolute monarchy and Christianity because of what happened after those revolutions.
Yeah, I still don't accept that the American Revolution was anti-Christian. But yeah, I will admit it was anti-monarchy. I'm not a monarchist.
It was moving
I think
away from
in some
Christianity.
circumstances, monarchy can be a sensible form of government, but I have no commitment to it.
Well, I suppose the reason why all these monarchs, beginning from Constantine, felt they had to have something that propped up their rule would be that they had a God-given right to govern the country. The Eastern form of it would be the mandate of heaven in China. I'm sorry. And where was I?
I sort of lost the plot in our discussion. What was the point that we were driving at here?
Yes, I'm trying to remember what I was trying to say before I was interrupted by the call, and it is this: the reason why Christianity was used to support the divine right of kings was that all absolute monarchies had to be invested with the idea of divine support to give it added authority. Otherwise, people would be thinking, well, you're just a mortal and fallible man, and why should we listen to you? And there are examples of it in China, which had the idea of the mandate of heaven, and in Japan. Before the end of the Second World War, the Japanese actually thought that their emperor was divine. And the Egyptian pharaohs had some idea of divinity too, invested in them. So, that is basically the idea of the divine right to rule. And obviously, absolute power. How does the saying go?
Corrupts.
Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there have been abuses of power, which the Americans first rejected with their American Revolution. And I suppose, having set a precedent, that the French, a few years later, had their own revolution because they rejected the rule of Louis XIV. Who taxed them too much, and it was unbearable. And again, in the Russian Revolution, that was the bad government that the peoples of America and France and Russia were rejecting. They were rejecting absolute monarchy.
Yes, I would agree with that.
And and I suppose my thesis is really that, it was a gradual process, from absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, particularly in the history of Britain. It was slowly eroded rather than, instantly. Well, I mean, we still have the monarchy now, but it is... the position of the monarch, has changed to somebody who was supposed to have the right to command that all his subjects follow his religion, which is, basically the rule contained in the Latin maxim, cuius regio eius religio, which meant whatever the religion of the monarch, that is the religion of his subjects. So, in fact, in Europe, Europeans had no freedom of belief at all. It was, in fact, illegal to be any other religion than the religion of your monarch. The Jews were allowed it, but that was only because, of their historical seniority, in the three Abrahamic faiths. And
and they were lending to the monarchs, which endeared them.
And yes, usury was useful for financing wars, because war finance is usury, and so over the years, after the English king became, went from being Catholic to Protestant, the powers of the absolute monarch have been eroded and diluted until we get to the stage where a prince whose mother is the queen can now be convicted of something that isn't even a crime. In the UK, when he was alleged to have sex with a 17-year-old American female, but Britain is in fact treated as if it were California or Florida, where the age of consent is 18. So, the British are in a very low position indeed, compared to, because we are in effect being treated as, what is it, the 51st state?
Okay, I don't know about that. I guess going back, so I agree that European monarchs derived legitimacy and institutional support from the Catholic Church. That's largely why they promoted Catholicism. Past a certain point, their own administrative class could perform the duties once performed by the church, and they saw an advantage for their own national interests to nationalize the church and create their own kind of mini popes in their own person, like you say. That was the initial driving force behind Protestantism. But then also you had the spread of literacy, printing. More people wanted to interpret the Bible for themselves. This led to all the different Protestant sects cropping up, and that weakened the structure of authority that had until then prevailed in Europe. There's also class interests, with the mercantile class generally being more open-minded, more widely traveled. They wanted to consider other ideas. They were often the ones interested in these perennialist, occultist strains like Masonry and things like that. They didn't like the religious oppression from existing governments. And so they contributed to these revolutionary forces and until we got them, right? I don't support monarchy as a necessary mode of government. I do support freedom of speech.
It would be un-American for you to do so, wouldn't it? It would be un-American for an American to support monarchy.
Yeah, there are American monarchists. I've talked to a few, and they do make good points. Like I guess Moldbug is the most famous
does he support
monarchist.
a monarchy?
What's that?
Does he support a monarchy, Moldbug?
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow. I mean, I know Jay Dyer does, but I mean, I know a few other Americans who seem to support a monarch, but I suppose I find it surprising, well, if not actually shocking, for an American to want that, because it's like everybody has given it up. Even the Chinese gave it up last century, and you guys seem to want it back. But I mean, obviously there were problems, which is why the American Revolution happened, because the monarch that the Americans rebelled against was George III, who was a bit mad, wasn't he?
That's what they say. I don't know myself, but yeah. Well, I don't support monarchy. I don't necessarily support democracy. In general, I'm a Platonist when it comes to metaphysics and politics.
What
So
does
I think
that
what you
mean?
need is a meritocratic system that allows the best ideas to win out. It doesn't suppress certain ideologies for political reasons. You need the educational system to feed into the administrative class. This is like historically kind of how China was organized, right? But it was adaptive for them throughout their history at different points. I mean, there's been more than one point in history when China was de facto the greatest military power, but they're also a little too authoritarian and they have low rates of innovation, partly because of that. And maybe their distribution of IQ isn't as wide as European nations. But I think something of that, what's the term for it? When you have not a bureaucracy, but when you have like this administrative class based on testing and training to get into a position of authority. I'm blanking on the term, but anyway.
Competitive examinations. Scholars who wanted to work, in government had to do exams, didn't they, in China, and that created a meritocracy, and
Right.
This idea seemed to be found to be shocking and radical by the British, but basically, well, China declined during the Qing dynasty, didn't it? That there was the infamous reign of the Dowager Empress when, it wasn't intended to happen at all because she was only a concubine, but the emperor that she was concubine to was degenerate and, not up to the job. And eventually power fell to her, and she didn't govern the country well, or and that was when China was subject to all these foreign encroachments, and she always reacted in the wrong way, and ending eventually in the collapse of the Qing dynasty and civil war in China.
Right. And maybe you can pin that whole development on a failure of meritocracy. Right? Once you get a ruling class or an individual bloodline as the imperial power, then it's in their interest to prevent competitors from coming up. But of course, run that experiment out decades and centuries, and then you get a ruling elite who are not themselves competitive.
Yes, it was sclerosis was I suppose the problem, and if you have a bad person in charge, then everything's going to be worse, and you might have all kinds of laws that are supposed to protect your rights, such as the First Amendment, but if people are too afraid to assert those rights because they don't think the court will support them, then they're worth nothing more than the piece of paper that they're written on. And so, what is necessary for everything to work is the rule of law. And by the rule of law, I mean the desire to follow the law just because it is the law, that the rules are the rules and must be followed because they are the rules. And you would only feel like that about these rules that you want to follow if you thought that the rules come from the highest possible source, i.e. God. But
sure. Well, or you can imagine secular humanists understanding the relevance of a legal tradition, a robust legal tradition grounded in reason, but they're effectively making the same move. Right, enforcing a legal system that corresponds to the highest principle they admit. It may be reason, it may be a personal God. The other factor I think that's important to have is transparency. Even if you have a perfect system of laws, once your elite become opaque and you don't know what they're doing, they will probably skirt the law in order to advance their own interests. That's why Plato recommends that the guardians be kind of public citizens. And that's
yes, I mean the legal a legal maxim is that not only must justice be done, it must be seen to be done. It's not something you hear much about these days, but that would, that makes perfect sense to me. And therefore, I suppose the difference between the Abrahamic religions and Hinduism is that Hinduism doesn't have any tradition of the rule of law, because it doesn't really have any laws that are said to come from God. It's only the Torah and the Quran that contain laws that are said to come from God. And that is kind of what makes them makes people want to follow them, if they believe in the whole narrative of the Abrahamic God, which is the most powerful being conceivable, because he's supposed
No,
to be
I disagree. I
omniscient.
think in India, you don't have a powerful legal tradition as you do in the West, but you have a well-grounded kind of practical morality in the form of yoga, ascetic disciplines, rituals that are widespread. I'm not saying they're the most morally exemplary population, but the point is that virtue, in a way, comes before the law. You won't come to discover the best legal norms unless, in the first place, you have virtuous citizens. And India, above any other, I think, civilization, has developed those technologies of cultivating individual virtue. The
Have you been
Abrahamic
to India?
tradition enforces norms of fasting or whatnot, but none of them are as old as India's traditions or as scientific. There's nothing equivalent to the work of Patanjali in Christianity, for example.
I haven't heard of what you just said, and may I
Patanjali
know
wrote
if,
the Yoga Sutras.
right? So you have traveled to India and you stayed there a while to pick up these
No, I used to
traditions.
attend a temple, though, in the US, and I lived with an Indian for a while. I've never been, no.
Hmm. Hmm. Is there a reason why you reject the other world religions? You seem to have left your own for a while, explored Hinduism. What about the other ones?
So I guess to quote the YouTuber Ken Wheeler, or Theoria Apophasis, religion is secularized metaphysics. There is one truth, and it could be expressed in a wide variety of ways. Religions are good or bad to the degree to which they express that one eternal truth about the nature of things. I came back to Christianity because I believe that the nature of its symbols and the nature of its historical kind of beginnings, the figure of Christ, what he seemed to represent, does actually correspond to that universal truth the best, right? I favor Christianity over Hinduism because Christianity has the idea of a world eschatology. There's something sort of like that in Hinduism, but Hinduism is an essentially nationalistic religion. Like, non-Indians can't really be Hindus, as per the Vedas. And Christianity has the potential of serving as this global guiding force. It also has the idea of forgiveness at its core. And I think that's something that Hinduism, out of pride and conceit of knowledge, never admitted. They accepted the idea of devotion to a personal savior, which Christianity also has, but they don't emphasize the role of forgiving others so that we ourselves can be forgiven. Christianity leads to more humility. And I think because of that, it has more positive ethical consequences as a whole. If
Right.
it took from Hinduism some of those metaphysics that are more well-grounded philosophically, or even from Platonism, that would help Christianity regain its position as a tenable underlying worldview for Western civilization. But that would mean that Christians have to make some concessions, away from their presumptions to knowledge via revelation, and towards, scientific modes, philosophical modes of knowledge, which is a hard sell. But there have been certain periods in Christian history when Christianity was as competitive as any other school of thought. High scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas. There really wasn't anything better going on intellectually in the West. So it is possible for Christianity to kind of be at the top of the game of worldview competition, but it would take some work getting it there currently.
Have you explored Islam? Have you perhaps read the Quran?
I have read some of it. Yeah. I mean, the main problem with it is it's based on revelation, and I have no reason to accept these scriptures. Also, I don't like some of the
But you accept Christian revelation. So
What's that?
why would you accept Christian revelation?
Not verbatim, not every statement in the New Testament or Old Testament. I accept that. So I have like a kind of comparative mythologist perspective on religion, a Jungian, like Carl Jung perspective on religion, where we do have these archetypes structuring our modes of thought, and certain symbols can activate these archetypes. The archetypes are universal, like the God-man is a universal archetype. You can see it in all different world religions, and there can be a more or less adequate expression of this archetype in history or in religious symbols. So Christianity, the nature of the symbolic regime is adapted to what I take to be the correct disposition of these innate archetypes. It knows what to do with the psychic energies that we have, and that's why it's a good religion. Islam, I don't see Islam doing that to a similar degree.
Right, but Islam would certainly help with the rule of law because it's got all those rules.
Right, but if it's a rule of law that's not grounded in first principles and reason, but is instead grounded in revelation, then that's only going to work for people who will kind of, slavishly accept revelation as authoritative. And I don't think Westerners will.
Right. So, but Christians talk about revelation the whole time. So you accept Christian revelation, but not any
right,
other
but Westerners
kind of revelation.
Today won't. Right. We're not serfs anymore. We're not under feudalism anymore. We think for ourselves, and we're not going to stop doing that.
All right, but you seem to want Christianity because it's a religion of your ancestors. Is that the reason why you cleave to Christianity?
No, I think it is the world religion which has the necessary symbols to serve at a global scale, guiding humanity into a better future. I think it's true in the sense of its eschatology, right? What is the goal of Christianity? What is the aim of Christianity? To end up with a world led by Logos, or reason, with Christ as king. Right. And that's what I want for the world. There's no similar concept in Hinduism. There's no similar concept in, well, you could say there's a similar concept in Islam. I'm not that familiar with Islamic eschatology. As I understand it, though, this world is destroyed and then another world is where we end up.
Oh, I don't hold with eschatology at all. I take all these narratives with a pinch of salt. All I use to reason is the seven Noahide laws. I think they're fair enough, and I think earlier you agreed with me that they were fair enough.
Except number 7, idolatry and blasphemy is meaningless, and yet unless you define what that blasphemy is blasphemy against.
Yes, and I would be happy to define blasphemy for you. So idolatry, as far as Jews are concerned, which attracts a death penalty for them, is bowing before idols. And blasphemy is saying and doing anything apart from bowing before idols that would be offensive to God if he exists.
Well, yeah, you want to avoid offending God, but how do you know what offends God unless you have this kind of grounding philosophy or theology, telling you about his will?
I'm happy to explain. So according to the Christian narrative, Jesus was convicted of blasphemy because he said his papa was God. So if he was telling lies, then obviously God, if he exists, would find it offensive. In the same way that I'm sure he would find it offensive if I said, you know, the God of Israel and Allah is my papa. So I think that's pretty clear about the
Yeah,
blasphemy
no, I do
of Jesus.
accept the possibility of an avatar of God, though. I think God is not simply transcendent over the world, he's transcendent and immanent in the world. So
I don't
God
know what
does
that
appear
means.
in his creatures.
I don't know what this transcendent and immanent thing means.
Well, okay, so on the one hand, you could have, God completely outside the world, never entering in. Like you could never find God in the world because he's always up there in heaven, separate. Or God could be immanent in the world, right? A pantheist would believe that God essentially is the being of the world. That there's no fundamental distinction between God and the world. And that would be
I
a
see.
wholly immanent concept of God. Wholly transcendent, God is totally separate. Wholly immanent, God is fundamentally the world itself. I'm neither of those positions. I'm a panentheist, not a pantheist, which means that there is the transcendent aspect of God. In Platonism, that would be the one beyond participation. And then there's also the participated aspect of God that can be found in the world itself. And I think it's perfectly natural to worship God's theophanies in the world.
What does that mean?
Theophany is just the idea of God appearing. A lot of Christians have interpreted certain appearances of angels and figures like Melchizedek in the Old Testament as theophanies or Christophanies, even appearances of the avatar of God.
Right. But we know from the Bible that Jews take a very strict view about idolatry because we know how many Jews were executed for worshipping the golden calf. Do we not?
Yeah, they're anti-idolatry, sure.
Yes.
But I'm not a Jew.
We also know that it's forbidden by in the Ten Commandments, don't we?
Right. I look at that as specific to Jewish religion. I don't
Well,
go as
but
far as some
Christianity is the
Gnostics.
worship of a Jew.
Wait, say
I don't
again?
see how you can. I mean, Christianity is Gentiles worshipping a Jew, isn't it? I mean, I don't see how you can, just laugh it off. You have to refer to the prior religion to explain, the religion that comes after it, which is Christianity.
Right. You can refer to it, but
Yeah,
the
because
law was
without
changed.
Judaism, there
Certain
would be
things
no
about the law.
Jews.
Also, the
Without
Jews
Jews,
didn't
there
have
would.
an understanding. The Jews didn't know that God could make an appearance in the world.
They entirely reject the idea. So they think Christians are idolaters and blasphemers.
Right. And I don't think that's true.
You wouldn't because you've chosen Christianity. But then how can you prove that Jesus is indeed God? But then you'll say, but you're not a Trinitarian. But you do believe Jesus is divine, don't you?
Yes.
And therefore it is a form of idolatry if it is the case that God is transcendent, which is the Jewish view and the Muslim view.
Yeah, and I think that's where they're wrong. He's not simply transcendent. He's transcendent and immanent. This
Okay,
is
it's
all
like
through
having it both
metaphysics.
ways,
Right.
that Jesus is both God and fully man,
Mhm.
which sounds easy enough to understand, but with the rule of the excluded middle, I don't see how it can possibly be true. Are you familiar with the idea of the Holy Spirit?
Yes.
What do you think is the Holy Spirit?
That's a good question. This is why I'm not a strict Christian Trinitarian. I think in terms of Platonic metaphysics and theology more than I think in terms of Christian metaphysics and theology. the Holy Spirit is effectively a medium between interlocutors. It's how something is transmitted from one to another. In Platonism, there was the order of spirits, right? That's what fulfilled this role, right? Like Socrates had his presiding daimon, his spirit that told him when to refrain from doing certain things. You know, the idea of the muses in Greek culture, or the genius in Roman culture, filled this role, like divine inspiration. How do the communications of higher beings reach mankind? It's through the mediation of this spirit realm, right? So I think the Holy Spirit is kind of a simplification of the order of spirits in its entirety.
Well, I would have thought that the Holy Spirit serves a very obvious purpose. It's actually a Jewish idea. I was surprised when I first heard of it, but it's a Jewish idea. And when you realize it's a Jewish idea, it becomes clear the purpose of the Holy Spirit, which is to be the agent of God. So God sends the Holy Spirit to do his work, because he can't, according to the logic of the system that he created, because the Jewish and Islamic view of God is that he is transcendent, so he can't enter into the universe that he created. So he has to send somebody, and that would be the Holy Spirit.
That just seems very odd to me, though, because then how can God be omnipotent? If he can't do something, how is he omnipotent?
Because he created a system of rules that he himself cannot disobey, because to disobey them would be to show intellectual incoherence, and he wouldn't be intellectually incoherent, and therefore that is the purpose of the Holy Spirit. He just does stuff for God, because God, according to the logic of his creation, cannot enter into the universe.
Okay,
Because he is very
let's
strict
reframe
against
this, because it's an
idolatry.
interesting theological question. So is God, in your view, distinct from the logic of his creation? You know, God's logic, is that distinct from God himself? Does God create logic, or is he himself logic?
Well, if God is indeed omnipotent and omniscient, he wouldn't create an illogical universe. So using these ideas, we can reconcile this problem of, whether God is transcendent or immanent. Because I think you are probably aware that Spinoza was a pantheist, and he was excommunicated because of his heresy.
Yeah, no, but I asked the question of identity regarding logic and God. What is the station of logic, right? The logic of the world is not identical to the world itself, I assume you would hold. And then the logic that God uses to create the world, is that distinct from God? So there's two scenarios here. Either God is at the same time his logical principles he uses to create the world, and then the world is made in that image, or God, who is not bound by any logic, creates logic somewhat arbitrarily, and then uses that to shape the nature of the world. So is logic a creature, or is logic also the being of God?
Well, it's a difficult question for me to answer, because I am, in fact, agnostic. But I would assume that an omnipotent and omniscient God would create a logical universe.
Right, but you're kind of skipping the middle term. Would God need to create logic itself, or would he already be logos? Right, that's the claim in
He would.
Christianity, that God is
Okay.
not just the creator of logic, he is logos.
Well, the idea of God would include logic. That is how I would put it.
Right. Okay, so the way I would look at an avatar then is as a representation of that logic. If the reason of the world is inherent in God's nature, then an unfolding, a revelation of that reason in the world would be a revelation of God's very nature. And then, God wouldn't be fully transcendent, because we would actually have access to him here. So the idea of the avatar would be a being that all of whose actions is perfectly in line with that reason used to create the world. Every activity of him is a representation of God's essence. And so basically, a being free of all sin would be a representation of God in the world.
I'm afraid I don't understand what you just said.
Okay, let's not worry about it.
Okay. But I don't see why there is this need to want God to be physically with us, as long as we know that eventually we will meet him, if that is our belief in the afterlife and in its existence. Because, as we go about our lives now, there is no explicit right for us to meet with him. It's only in death that we are supposed to meet our maker. That was, a tradition of belief, wasn't it?
Among Jews?
Among Christians and Jews. I mean, the idea is that, we don't get to meet God until we're dead. That's the narrative.
Well, that's certainly not the traditional Christian view, seeing as Christianity was founded on the people who met God in person.
Well, Christianity is full of inconsistencies and is internally inconsistent. In my
Again,
view.
I go back to interpreting religion mythologically and in terms of the innate archetypes of the psyche and in terms of that kind of rationality of the world itself. I'm not so concerned with the particular systems that have been built out of the Christian myth. The Christian myth is wider than any one denomination. Christianity isn't identical to Catholicism or Orthodoxy or any Protestant denomination. The symbols are more fundamental. And if you can read the symbols in a way that, corresponds to a coherent philosophical system, then you don't run into this issue of inconsistency. I do agree that particular denominations always run into inconsistencies, but that's because we haven't had a philosophical Christianity, not fully. The closest we approximated that was probably Thomas Aquinas. And, since then, we'll see what happens with Catholicism. Maybe they'll get back on track. But
I don't see how it's possible, because it's already, if you're Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is divine. All right. I mean, there's no getting around that. Is there?
Well, I mean, Arian Christians are called Christians.
Yeah, but they don't believe that Jesus is co-equal, co-eternal, and co-substantial with God as Trinitarians do, but they believe that he's a little bit divine, right?
Sure, a messenger, similar to the role of Muhammad, right? A messenger of God, something like that.
Well, no.
Or a privileged
it's Unitarian Christians who say that Jesus is mortal, but they believe it, but they're gonna.
Yeah.
But then Unitarianism was considered heresy. I
don't care what was considered heresy, because who was it considered heresy by? An institution. I don't trust the foundation of that institution. I don't agree fully with the Council of Nicaea. I'm not an Orthodox Christian. I don't think that should have the privileged place of defining what Christianity is.
Well, it's Christian tradition that, I suppose, is over you, because you are, you're not a Christian of any kind, and therefore you have no, priestly authority to pronounce on this or that. You can just say, I don't agree with the Catholic Church or whatever, but the Catholic Church is above you, surely.
I don't accept these ideas of authority. I think that reason is actually enough to get us to agreement on theology, metaphysics, and everything down the line. So insofar as the Catholic Church is promoting a rational theology that makes sense, I'll support the authority of the Catholic Church. But I don't just support the Catholic Church because.
Well, so are you a confirmed Catholic?
Yeah, I was confirmed in high school when I truly did believe in the teachings of the church. But since then, I don't believe. I'm not really, a convictional Catholic, you might say, but I am a practicing Catholic because there aren't adequate places to worship in this world as it exists. Christianity is kind of fallen. The institutions, obviously, the Catholic Church is a fallen institution in a lot of ways. And yet, that's where I can go to express my worship of God and fellowship with others. And I think that's a good thing in itself, right?
Well, in terms of regular worship, people prefer to, they prefer the worship that they customarily practice. And that was one of the reasons why Henry VIII refused to, well, he was very clear about not changing anything about Christian worship, even as he became his own pope. He wouldn't even change the words in the Book of the Common Prayer that blessed the Catholic Church. It's still there because he knew that any change in any of the wording of any of the prayers or any change in the ritual would be noticed by the unlettered peasants who will immediately start getting upset. So he knew not to change anything of the sort,
Right.
as long as the priests knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
So
I have no problem with the ritual of the Mass, but that's not the same as the Catholic Church, right? There are a set of Vacantists who practice Catholicism identically to Catholics. If there was the right sort of Sedevacantist church in my area, I might go there, but I'm not going to drive 2 hours every Sunday, The ritual of the Mass also is far older than Christianity itself. I mean, it has its roots in the mysteries of Eleusis, and I do see the continuation of some of those more ancient metaphysics and rituals through Christianity. I do see that as providentially guided, right? Like,
but it's
look at
ritual
Christianity's year
cannibalism.
zero of history, and everything is set down then. I think it's weaving together various strains that had already existed into a vehicle that has the power to be this global religion.
Well, it's only global because of Western imperialism. People just go for the religion of the most powerful people around, and at the time, Christians were the most powerful people around. And they thought, well, they must be doing something right. What is their religion? Right, I'll follow that one. Nothing more complicated than that, surely.
Well, I don't know, because Zoroastrianism didn't win out, even though the Persians were really widespread. And sure, they were defeated, but Christianity didn't spread by being the religion of the conquering people. I mean, it was a religion of the underclass, and some Roman aristocrats adopted Christianity, but that's not how it initially spread. I think it was because it spread because it resonated with many different mythological many different myths around the Mediterranean that were popular. It had its resonances in the rites of Eleusis. It had its resonances with the Mithraic mysteries. It had resonances with Platonism. It seemed to tie together a lot of strains of spiritual thought. And this was like an extremely active period, first centuries BC and AD, for religious cults, for spiritualist movements, and
they just put on a good
put them all
show
together in the right way and became adaptive because of its symbolic contents.
The Catholic Church are very good at putting on a good show, smells and bells and music and lighting. Look at any Pope's funeral; they do it beautifully.
That's not why the church spread. The church, the early church spread before all the pageantry associated with.
By military conquest, yes. I mean the tradition.
It didn't spread by conquest until the 4th, 5th centuries, right? The first 3 centuries, it spread because of its natural fitness as a myth.
Well, I think it was always the tradition, but even before Christianity, that if my tribe fought your tribe and you won, it would be assumed that your God had triumphed over our gods. That was kind of the implicit assumption in any tribal war. Every tribe has a god, and when they go to war with another tribe, it's about their gods fighting each other.
Yeah, and it's very true because those gods are the foundation on which a tribe builds its morals, its way of life. And so when one tribe conquers another, why is it able to do that? Because its foundation is more secure. Its gods are more powerful.
Yes, so the God of Israel is, well, the most powerful conceivable, is it not? And that is why Christianity and Islam are
No, I
derived
don't
from
think it's the most
Judaism.
powerful conceivable. I think
What other God is more powerful than the Abrahamic God?
I think Brahman, the Platonic one, subsumes every function of Yahweh in the Old Testament and also much more, right? Like not creating just this one world, but many worlds, not, being able to enter into his creation at the same time. Many Gnostics kind of interpreted the God of the Old Testament in terms of the Platonic concept of the demiurge, right? And Yahweh does perform more of that demiurgic function, which is like the crafter, the creator, rather than the more kind of simple unitive role of the metaphysical first principle of being itself, right? By the time you get to the behavior of Yahweh, he's deliberating, he's thinking about what he wants to do. And like there's multiplicity in the idea of Yahweh already, and you don't explain how that comes into being. And the only principle that you could refer to explain the particular characteristics of Yahweh would be a more general principle. And that's going to lead back to this Platonic concept of the one or the Hindu concept of Brahman. It's not easy to understand. Only small numbers of people in any civilization ever gravitate towards it and understand it. And then they project myths that accord with it. And that's what's popularly taken up. But no, I don't think Yahweh is the most powerful conceivable being. I think the one is the greatest possible being.
Well, the evidence of that would be, the God of Israel made Jews his chosen people, and they are indestructible.
No, I think that's also why Christianity, rather than some other religion, Christianity is in a certain sense a response to Judaism, right? In
It
any
is the
world.
antithesis to Judaism. So, I mean, but then there is a certain irony, isn't there? Isn't there, when Christianity is infamous for creating the anti-Semitism that they've always been complaining about, and there you have the irony of these people who are supposed to hate Jews worshipping a Jew as the co-equal of the God of Israel, who is also Allah.
Yeah, a Jew who called the Jewish establishment at his time the synagogue of Satan, right? So I think it's not as simple as he was ethnically Jewish, therefore we worship Jews.
Yeah, but who wrote? Who wrote the New Testament? It's not God. It's some guys called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are men. They're mortal and fallible men of dubious provenance. Nobody's really heard of them outside the Christian scriptures.
Okay, the same applies to any religious scripture. Like, we don't really know that Muhammad even was a historical figure or wrote the Quran. Like,
the thing is, Muslims don't believe that Muhammad wrote the Quran. So, I mean, the analogy would be that Muhammad was the sound box.
I see. Right. But in terms of like the kind of early archaeological data about the beginnings of the spread of Islam, there's some conflicting evidence whether it was even similar to what eventually became mainstream Islam. There's some early coins that have Christian images alongside, the crescent moon and star. I haven't looked into it in a while, but the point is, from a historical perspective, none of the supposed prophets of the world's major religions are, founded in really solid ground. It's all speculative, and it takes a leap of faith to believe that they actually composed these things. But going back to the question of like Christianity and its relation to Israel, I think any world will have the influence of Satan exercised to some degree or another, right? The theory of evil that I subscribe to is that articulated by Proclus, who was a Neoplatonist, 5th century Neoplatonist, and his view of evil is that it is essentially parasitical. Why does evil exist? Because all good, for the world to be the best of all possible worlds, all good has to exist. And there is a certain degree of good that comes out of, using the energy of other beings for your own purposes. If the parasite didn't exist, then the good that the parasite experiences wouldn't exist. But
well,
yeah,
carry on.
Well, yeah, the point is evil is essentially parasitical, but it will always collapse. And so in any world, a people and a religion will represent more parasitism or less. And I think objectively, just based on the behavior of the Jews in the Old Testament, they took a parasitical strategy. They didn't build the buildings in Jerusalem. They came into this land and took everything for themselves. They didn't have to do the work. They did enslave others, right? They were a very parasitical kind of people compared to other peoples around the world. And so Satan introduces an influence into whatever world and tries to gain control of that world through probably that people. And it seems like maybe has Satan used this people for that purpose? Very possibly. And so it makes them into this powerful group. Yeah, it fits. And then so how do you combat this? God providentially would use the momentum of that same people and their ideas that they're promoting. He would use that to undo it, right? God turns all things to good. So essentially what the Jews were doing lined up with Satan's interest, but because God turns all things to good, he used Christianity, he used a Jew to convert that into a way of bringing about a better world.
The conquest of Canaan by Jews is simply explained by the fact that God protected the Jews, and while their 40 years of wilderness, they actually followed the Torah. And when they established Israel, they got too big for their boots and did whatever they liked. So the narrative seems to me that, if you follow God's laws, you'll get what you want. And at the time, the Jews did follow God's laws. And also, as regards Satan, Muslims defined Satan as rebellion from God, and the Orthodox Jewish view of Satan is that Satan is, in fact, the prosecuting counsel of God. So Satan is actually working hand in fist with God. So
right, yeah.
It's a rather different idea to the Christian idea of Satan, who is, separate from us.
Yeah, I think speaking more generally than the revealed theologies of Judaism or Christianity, there is in whatever world, like imagine any possible world, there will be a more parasitical force and a more generative force, right? Only God creates. So what does Satan want to do? He wants to use what God creates. The way I'm using the term,
he wants to lead
you
them
can use
astray.
some other term as well, like the source of parasitical control, right? The archetype of parasitical control. And some forces in a world will lean towards generation or parasitism. Okay, so we have an extreme of parasitism. I mean, even in the structure of the Jewish religion, the relation of the Levites to the other tribes, they are opaque, they are closed off, and they receive their tithes, their taxes. They parasite off of the other Jewish tribes, and they're a closed society.
The priestly tribe. So of course you'd expect them to,
right,
not
they're not an open
farmers
society
and merchants,
like the
because they've
guardians.
already got
I have
an
no problem
occupation.
with like a priestly people guiding things, But when it's behind closed doors, right, when they're back there behind the veil, you don't, I mean, that's just setting up, based on human psychology, the room for a lot of abuse to take place. And I think obviously that has taken place. Whereas more open and ascetic priest classes ruled in different parts of the world, that led to the greater good and generation, and not all of these schemes and
They're all
usury and the stuff that's
corruptible.
characterized Israel.
They're all corruptible, though, aren't they?
Yeah, but compare the achievement of the Christian clergy under high scholasticism to anything that the community of rabbis did. It seems like the community of rabbis has always been concerned with advancing their own interests rather than advancing learning. You know, it's not until the last couple centuries that some, you know, secular Jews actually contributed to science. That was all done by Gentiles who were trying to improve the world in general, right? These scientists, mathematicians in the medieval period, early modern period, they all believed in God, believed that God was revealed through the world, and they were looking to, because they were an open society. Anybody could join that. It wasn't closed off. And then they lived in ascetic ways.
Sorry, which period are you talking about? Because Jewish emancipation didn't begin until after the French Revolution. I mean,
Yeah,
Jews
they
were not
could have set
treated
up
as equal citizens before the French Revolution.
Right, but the Jews didn't build the university system.
Well,
They didn't
how could they? How could they without their own homeland? Well, they're
they had an
living
intellectual.
in Christendom.
No, that's not a good argument, because they had their own intellectual traditions, and they used that
they did.
for practicing their pill pull and practicing their forms of manipulation of the people around them. Like, they didn't use it for the greater good of mankind. They used it for parasitism, and that was their choice.
Can you give an example of their parasitism?
Usury in the medieval period, getting in line with the kings, right. Getting in line with the monarchs, getting special privileges.
So if you want to ban usury, you should have adopted Islam since the 7th century, surely. Because it does specifically ban usury. So
right. Well, it's also prohibited in the New Testament.
Really, but the Vatican Bank charges interest.
I know. That's why I don't believe in the Catholic Church as an institution.
So surely the Quran is a better guide, since it does explicitly forbid usury.
No, I mean, Muslim countries, they have different lending standards, but they do lend at interest.
Well, they're not supposed to practice it, so
no one lives up to their principles.
Well, but at least we know that the Quran actually says don't do it. Well, the New Testament doesn't say anything of the sort.
Yes, it does. The New Testament says lend without expecting anything back. It goes further than usury. It says just give. Don't lend and restrict the amount of interest you charge. Just give. That's the commandment.
Well, nobody's just going to give away their money, are they? I mean, we have to be realistic.
That's what Jesus tells us to do.
Well, it's vague and extremist, so people are just going to ignore it because they think it's stupid.
No, people haven't ignored it. Christian altruism has had a huge impact on the world. I mean, it was the kind of guiding ethos behind European colonialism in many instances.
Well, talking about
lifting these people up, we shaped the world with Christian altruism.
Yeah, when you decided that usury was okay, that was the time of John Calvin. He was so popular because he said usury was okay. So
but that's not an indictment against Christianity as a myth.
The Christian position on usury has been incoherent and inconsistent.
Right. Like I said, problems of consistency and incoherence appear in these particular church institutions that are
because
not
the New Testament is unclear, because it doesn't have unity.
I agree. Yeah, the New Testament is not a perfect document, right? I'm looking at it mythologically. I'm looking at the symbols and stories we received, and that's how Christianity initially spread, not on the back of the New Testament, which didn't exist. Initially for the first 100 years, it spread on the back of the gospel, which was a story, which was a myth. And that's what Christianity is to me. And that doesn't mean it's not true. It's a myth rather than a particular set of documents.
Well, if you want to keep your group in existence, then the test of morality must be how long that moral system has kept your group in existence. And Judaism appears to have withstood the test of time, either because there's something inherently effective in the rules of Judaism, or because God protects his chosen people.
That something has survived, I don't think is evidence that it is true. No. And I think if truth is going to survive in the world, if God's influence is going to survive, I think it's very likely that it will flower in a certain place at a certain time, and then that people will decline because human beings are fallible, and then it will reappear somewhere else. And I think that's been the tendency with Sophia Perennis, perennialism. It appears in different times and different places when people are ready to receive it because they've prepared themselves through moral discipline, they've prepared themselves with rational training, this sort of thing. So I don't think that the existence of singular institutions or even singular ethnic identities through time is evidence that that is the truth of God. God's truth, I think, has appeared in many times, in many places, in different forms. And you can't stop providence, and you don't need one particular ethnicity or one particular institution to forward it. God will act regardless.
Well, that would be, the simplest way of understanding the nature of the Abrahamic God, that he keeps his promises in the form of keeping Jews around to annoy Gentiles who practice the idolatry and blasphemy that he has specifically and explicitly forbidden.
I don't believe in the promises that are depicted in the Old Testament. I think that is, Israelite self-flattery, if anything. I think, many tribes believe that their God looks out for them in particular and privileges them in particular. I mean, that's kind of the default belief. It's a very
Which other tribes
mundane.
can say it so convincingly? I mean, considering, Jews were without their homeland for 2,000 years and managed to get it back again because they managed to stay in existence and apart from others.
Yeah, that doesn't prove that God intended that specifically. God obviously allowed it to happen, but that doesn't mean that this is the vehicle that God is using to express his will in the world. It just doesn't logically follow. That something survived specifically doesn't mean that it's true. And this satanic force that I mentioned before, the parasitism of trying to gather the energies of others into yourself, that results in power centers that do survive for a very long period of time. That doesn't mean that every power center is, by the will of God or is necessarily a representative of the truth. I don't believe that.
Well, it's a sign. I mean, you can interpret it any way you like, but it doesn't mean that just because they are in existence, that they're having a good time, because it is easy to keep somebody around just to torture them and make an example of them, for example. But if we want to believe in the narrative of the Abrahamic God, then we know that he would be involved in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And if we examine those religions separately, we will see that there's a pattern to it. I mean, and Hegelian analysis would kind of explain the Abrahamic faiths, in that Judaism would be thesis, Christianity would be antithesis, and Islam would be synthesis, which makes it rather neat.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not theologically an Abrahamist. I don't believe in the accounts of the Old Testament, as I think they are metaphorical and often do contain truths. And I don't think Israel has been universally a negative force. But I don't buy this argument that because these religions have been long-lived, because they've exerted a wide influence, that they're necessarily representative of the truth. In most ages, like the popular theories, the things that most people believe are not true. People always believe in falsehoods. So like it's basically a like what do you call it? What's the name of the fallacy? An appeal to the masses writ large. I don't buy it. It's a logical fallacy, and it's not the way I think. I think in terms of rational first principles, philosophical reasoning, and these sorts of historical arguments are just like I guess you can accept them, but there's no logical force to accept them.
I'm not even talking about the truth of these religions. I'm talking about the utility of them. So as regards Judaism, it's useful to keep Jews in existence, right? And maybe their existence is useful to Gentiles because we will be wondering why the hell God chose them and what the hell they were chosen to do. And then we can ask ourselves, how come Christianity happened if it is idolatry and blasphemy? We could ask ourselves that question, and we can maybe ask ourselves, which is the best scripture, bearing in mind there are really only two supposed to come from God. And I would argue that the one to choose would be the one without the 36 capital offenses of Judaism. So even Jews, if they believed in their narrative, would wish to escape the horror of all the death penalties that they might have collected in one lifetime, which will be probably more than one, if they, considering that breaking the Sabbath attracts a death penalty.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think about religion in these terms. It's not about selecting from a menu of options. I think you can think about the truth of these things philosophically, and that's led me to my current beliefs. So these arguments for the utility of these nations through history, I mean, it remains to be seen what will be done with Christianity, what will be done with the Jewish people. And like, it's not like I abandon the idea of utility. Part of why I think the Christian symbology is appropriate is that it can serve a beneficial role for mankind as a whole. And it's poised to do that potentially, provided the right kind of revival takes place, the right kind of grounding in philosophical reasoning, rational theology, something that makes sense of modern science. It could be done. Obviously, it's not guaranteed. But all of that is historical contingencies, and I'm not interested in, coming up with my worldview on that basis. I would rather come up with my worldview on the grounds of philosophy, not just kind of, rooting for whatever team is winning historically, ostensibly. And also, the story's not over. We don't know who wins.
Well, I would agree with you that the story's not over, but if we are to believe in a living God, he might be waiting for us to come to the right conclusion about which moral system to follow, bearing in mind that Christianity is kaput and we live in the West.
Okay, might be, but you'd have to come up with reasons why we should believe that.
Well, are you prepared to read the Quran to check out its claims?
I have looked at it, and I don't get the sense that the author of that document cared about the truth. It seems it seems to want to instill fear and submission more than anything else in the people who read it. And that's not an attitude that you should take to perceiving the truth. You don't understand the truth when you're afraid and when you're bowing down. That's just not conducive to philosophical truth. So I don't like the spirit of the Quran. Also, I don't like the fruits of Islam. I don't like Islamic societies the way they're structured. I don't like the life of Muhammad as far as I understand I understand it.
Well, surely if you had to choose between leading the life of Muhammad and being crucified as Jesus, it's a no-brainer, isn't it?
No, no. First, I'm not I'm not a pedophile. I'm not gonna, I would not live the life of Muhammad. I would I wouldn't pretend to be Christ. I don't think my sacrifice on a cross would do as much good. But no, I would much prefer the life of Jesus.
Well, I'm talking about, ending your days, naturally or being executed through crucifixion. So, which verse in the Quran did you dislike?
It's been a while since I looked at it. I think even from the very beginning, it talks about this kind of need to fear God and recognize your powerlessness, which, yes, there is some spiritual utility in that, but it's the tone of the text.
Hmm.
Um,
But you
that
didn't read the nicer bits, and also in the Old Testament, there is this saying that the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord, and that's not in the Quran. And I suppose if we didn't fear him, then we wouldn't obey him, and if we didn't obey him, we wouldn't know what was good for us. And we have seen the consequences now, anyway, of not obeying the Noahide laws, haven't we? We don't obey most of them in the West.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call those laws unique to Abrahamism either. Like the laws of Manu in Hinduism reflect the Noahide laws pretty well, aside from idolatry and blasphemy.
Well, that is what makes Judaism. Surely it's very, very strict stance against idolatry and blasphemy, and also the narrative of Jesus, who
Yeah, well,
was
idolatry
crucified
and
for that
blasphemy,
blasphemy.
those all involve a question big, because you're assuming that your concept of God as transcendent is valid. You're assuming that your doctrines are correct, and I don't
Well,
believe your
Islam
doctrines are
and
correct on
Judaism
rational
are,
grounds. I think reason needs to accord with theology. Maybe
yes.
some things can come to us through revelation, but when I look rationalistically at traditional Jewish theology, I mean mystical Jewish theology, Kabbalah, the kind of Platonizing of Philo of Alexandria, it's totally possible to have a Jewish theology which is rationally coherent, but that's not the traditional one. And the traditional one I don't accept, because I don't accept a wholly transcendent God. Neither do I accept the theology of Islam. So we've been going for quite a while. Do you want to wrap up on anything in particular?
I'm happy to rest on the point of idolatry and blasphemy, and just point out that Judaism and Islam are agreed on the oneness of God and take the same position on idolatry and blasphemy, and that they are things to be avoided. I'd be quite happy to explain why idolatry and blasphemy are to be avoided, even as an agnostic, if you want to stay around for that. But maybe it could be a discussion for another
They
time.
may be agreed. I think the underlying metaphysics of perennialism also has a lot of historical agreement in different eras, in different civilizations. That's what I subscribe to. And the Christian myth is the best vehicle in our world to represent that.
Is there a book on perennialism
There are
that you
many
want to
books,
recommend?
right? You could look at the traditionalist school in general. It's a set of authors. Kuraswamy, Gainan, Evola, Eliade, and Shuan. They're not my favorites. Joseph Campbell is effectively a perennialist. He's probably my favorite thinker. Carl Jung was something of a perennialist. Those are all good sources. Aldous Huxley wrote a book, The Perennial Philosophy, where he lays out the basic doctrines, perhaps oversimplifies it, but it is a helpful kind of handbook to look at the common beliefs of perennialist systems. And then you can kind of branch out from there. It's a wide body of literature. But I'm really a Platonist, and I think a lot of perennialist threads in the West come through Platonism. So I mean, Plato, Proclus, the Platonic commentators through history. That's kind of the core of the metaphysics, historically speaking, that I subscribe to. And then also some modern philosophers who tended towards perennialism, like Leibniz. In the contemporary period, Chris Langan is a perennialist and has a system, a rationalistic system, metaphysics, theology that I mostly agree with. I don't claim to fully understand it. Very few people do. He's the highest recorded IQ known. But yeah, so those are some resources if you wanted to look into it. But
Thank you. Could you briefly explain what Platonism is?
Yeah, well, I mean, Plato obviously is the kind of first canonical philosopher in the Western tradition. There are only fragments of anyone before Plato. So this is the body of work, the Platonic dialogues, that represents the beginning of the Western philosophical canon. And he's famous for the theory of forms, right? Explaining the problem of the one and the many, right? Why is it that we have one name for various objects? Is there such a thing, for example, as a triangle in itself, or are there only ever particular triangles? The realm of forms is the idea that there is a realm of universals, not just particulars. And that is built out in a whole metaphysical system, has a bunch of implications. Plato seems to have agreed with the doctrine of reincarnation. He has the idea of anamnesis, or that all knowledge is ultimately remembered from a source that is internal. Knowledge, he could be characterized as a Gnostic, because knowledge is derived from within. We have access to intellect, or nous, which is kind of the holder of all of these forms. And yeah, I mean, he gets quite technical and mathematical at times. Plato actually was instrumental in building, through his academy, the deductive methods in geometry and arithmetic that Greek mathematics was built on. So a hugely significant figure, universally recognized as the founder of Western philosophy, effectively.
So Plato's ideal forms, would you say that an ideal form is the perfect table, the perfect horse,
right?
Or do you mean the archetypal?
Archetypal and perfect, both. Yes.
Right. So would you agree that the Abrahamic God is the ideal form of a divinity?
No, I certainly would not.
What is?
See, what characterizes the archetypes and the forms is simplicity, right? Yahweh is a complex figure, and there are no principles to explain why he has the attitudes he has. Platonist theology is rationalistic in that you can deduce why individual deities have their properties and have their energies from more general principles, and they all have to lead back to the idea of the good and the one itself. So yeah, I would not say that Yahweh or Abrahamic concepts of theology approximate to any ideal. They're just one particular historical school of thought, in my view.
All right. Well, thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yeah, it was very stimulating. Thank you, Claire. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.